Hello and welcome to this webinar on how to respond to public consultations for applications for authorization. My name is Matti Vainio and I'm heading the Risk Management Implementation Unit here at ECHA. I have the pleasure of moderating the discussions today. We do not normally hold webinars when we start a public consultation, but this time we do so. The reason is that today we started 40 public consultations for applications for authorization. This is the largest group of public consultations that ECHA has ever made. The consultations relate to the use of hexavalent chromium, arsenic compounds, diglyme, and 1,2-dichloroethane. The main purpose of the consultations is to receive information for alternative substances or technologies on the uses applied for. In this webinar, we focus on identifying and sharing good practice on how to provide information on alternatives. The webinar will also inform how public consultations in applications for authorization work in general. The webinar is based on the lessons learned from over 50 consultations carried out so far. It also gives us an opportunity here at ECHA to get feedback and further develop the consultation process. We will start with an overview of the public consultation process. This will be made by Sanna Henriksson. After this, we will have 4 commentaries and a panel discussion. We want to get different angles related to the consultations and therefore invited our 4 stakeholders to join us. They have all been active in the application for authorization process. They have been critical stakeholders who have all added value to the public consultation. Our panelists are Frida Hök, she is from the non-governmental organization Chemical Secretariat, Hugo Waeterschoot, who is from the European industry organization Eurometaux, Ahlskog, who represents companies that have alternatives, and Julius Waller, who has prepared several applications for companies. We will then, at the end, conclude the webinar with a question and answer session. Before we start, a couple of technicalities. You can submit your questions at any time during the webinar through the Q&A panel, which should be visible on your webinar window. Staff from my unit as well as the panelists will answer them. Please select the All Panelists option from the Q&A panel when submitting your questions. If you want to send your question to a specific speaker or several speakers, please mention their names at the start of your question. You can send your questions until the end of this webinar. We will answer as many questions as possible directly through the Q&A panel. So please monitor the Q&A panel and remain logged in to the webinar until a response arrives. We may not be able to answer all the questions during the webinar. If this happens, you can send your questions using the contact form which is visible on the screen. If you experience any technical difficulties with the webinar tool, please contact our technical support team through the Q&A panel or send them an email on the address visible on your screens. One last technical point. This webinar is recorded and will be published on our website shortly after the event. We will send a link to the recording and the presentations to all registered participants. Okay, let's move on to our first presentation. I will give the floor to Sanna Henriksson. She is a socioeconomic analyst who also works in my unit. She has worked as an authorization team manager for some applications for authorization and is also coordinating our work in the task force for workability of the applications for authorization. She is also particularly responsible for making sure that we make all relevant information available on the applications for authorization. She has worked earlier as a consultant where she was also involved in applications for authorization. So all in all, Sanna has a very versatile background and a lot of experience in the consultation process. So Sanna, please go ahead.
Thank you, Matti. My presentation is going to be on the role of public consultation in the application for authorization process. I'll start by outlining the purpose of the consultation, who should comment and why. Then I'll give some technical advice on how to comment. Then I'll outline some of the experiences that we've had so far with the public consultation in the application for authorization process. And I'll give some thoughts about what has been considered helpful and what has been considered not so helpful so far, and also some examples of these. And then finally, I'll talk about the next steps in the process. The role of the public consultation is to gather additional information on alternative techniques or substances. So this could relate to technical or economic information. It can be information about the availability of the alternative, or it can be information about the hazards and risks of the alternative. The important thing is that the comments received in the public consultation are used for the opinion development process by the committees for risk assessment and socioeconomic analysis. And it's therefore important that the public consultation is meaningful. Any third parties that have relevant information about alternatives should provide comments in the public consultation. This can be competitors or collaborators of the applicant. It can be clients or downstream users, or it could be suppliers or any other interested organizations such as industry organizations, non-governmental organizations, or research institutions. There are many reasons to provide comments in the public consultation. For companies, there may be market opportunities, name and fame. For anyone providing comments, there's the possibility to influence and to improve public health and the environment. There's also the possibility to provide information on why authorization is needed. For instance, this might be relevant for downstream users who see that there are some information gaps in the application and who want to provide additional information for the opinion development. The important thing is that the comments are relevant and focused. And this is because we don't want to waste your time, and we also don't want the time of others to be wasted. In terms of the technicalities, the public consultation lasts for 8 weeks. And so the consultation that we launched today will last until the 6th of April. The next one will be run from the 11th of May until the 6th of July. The consultation is entirely web-based, and it's possible to provide confidential comments. So for example, if you have some sensitive business information, you may claim this to be confidential information. Apart from those sections that are claimed confidential, all comments are made public on ECHA's website. The applicant themselves, they have the possibility to respond to the comments as well. And if they decide to do so, then the comments or the responses to the comments will be made available on ECHA's website as well. The committees, and in particular the rapporteurs responsible for the application, will take the comments into account in the opinion development process. And about 1 month after the end of the public consultation, third parties that have submitted comments may be invited to the so-called trialogue. This trialogue is an opportunity for applicants and the committee rapporteurs to discuss any of the information on alternatives that have been submitted in the public consultation, as well as any other technical or scientific issues with the application. And so third parties that have provided comments on the alternatives may also be invited to this trialogue. So this is something to keep in mind when you submit comments as well. If you require any support or if you have any questions during the public consultation, then you can contact us here at ECHA, the application for authorization team, at the email address shown there at the end of the screen. A bit of our experience to date. We've held public consultations on 68 uses applied for so far. And in these consultations, we received 704 public consultation comments. However, not all of them are unique, and this is because the same comment has sometimes been submitted in several consultations. Also, in some cases, we've seen that submitters seem to have been orchestrated by the applicant to gain support for the authorization. So far, the applicants have always responded to the comments received, and all of these comments and responses are available on ECHA's website. Also, we've seen that transparency greatly facilitates the public consultation. And this is because third parties, of course, need to have sufficient information about the users to actually submit relevant comments. And so here at ECHA, we've done quite a lot of work to increase transparency. And at the moment, about 90 to 95% of the information in the assessment reports are publicly available on our website. Now, a bit of information about what is considered helpful in the comments. So first of all, the whole purpose of the public consultation is to gather additional information about alternatives. And so the most helpful comments are really the ones that provide new information about the alternatives. And here, the more specific the comments are, the better. So we're interested in technical information, economic information, information about the availability of the substance or technology, as well as hazard information. Also, factual comments with clear evidence and references are really helpful. And this also facilitates the opinion development process in terms of processing the new information. It's helpful if the information is understandable and written in clear language. So remember that the audience that you're writing for is not necessarily familiar with all the kind of sector-specific processes and the technicalities of your processes. So keep this in mind when you submit information. Also, it's very helpful to understand how this new information may influence the authorization itself. So whether it is to not grant the authorization, or perhaps whether it is to whether it may lead to a shorter review period. For example, if the information shows that the alternative in question will be available earlier than what the applicant has claimed in its application. Also, it's possible to corroborate information in the application. So this may, for example, be the case for users of chemicals that really need the substance. So they may provide information about why they need it. In terms of the comments that are less helpful, again, these are the ones that don't really provide any new information about alternatives. As I've said, this is the purpose of the public consultation. Also, it's not so helpful to get comments about information that we already know about. And so this is the case with the hazards of the substance applied for. The substance is already known to be hazardous. It's been identified as a substance of very high concern. And so we don't really need more information about that. The same goes for the exposure information that should already be covered in the application. So it's not the purpose of the public consultation to comment on that. Also, we're not really looking for general criticism regarding whether to grant or not to grant the authorization. That's not the purpose, and we already know, again, that the substance is of very high concern. So this will be taken into account in the opinion development. Just to illustrate the past two slides a little bit, we prepared a few examples of what could be considered helpful and not so helpful comments. And so for the helpful comments, the first example reads, experience indicates that the switch to the alternative increases the cost of the final product by 1 to 3%. Now this is an example of quite specific economic information, which is helpful for the opinion development. The second example of a helpful comment refers to publicly available information, which states that the alternative will be available in a specific time frame. So here again, it's a comment that refers to publicly available information and that provides specific information for the opinion development. The third example is one providing additional information from a downstream user on sector-specific end-user requirements that haven't been fully outlined in the application. And so here, this is new information. It's filling an information gap from the application, and it's therefore useful. Moving on to examples of less helpful comments. The first two examples refer to risk management measures, as well as the exposure in the application. So neither of these two examples really provide any new information, and they're not therefore so relevant for the opinion development. The third example is one stating, it's one of a downstream users stating that they need the authorization, so please grant it. But here again, it doesn't provide any new information about why the downstream user needs it, nor about the alternatives and why they're unsuitable. And so this won't really help in the opinion development process. Now these are just some very illustrative examples, but they give you some kind of overview of what we consider helpful and not so helpful. So in terms of the next steps, here at ECHA, we'll now host this public consultation, and the next one, which will be launched in May, will actually be even larger. So we have quite a lot going on here. The webinar that we're holding today is a good opportunity for us to collect feedback about what works and what doesn't. And so we look forward for feedback from the audience as well and questions. For industry and other organizations, it would be really helpful if you could use your networks and get the right companies to know about the consultations and also about their purpose. For third parties with relevant information, we really hope that you provide comments. They will be taken into account in the opinion development. And finally, here at ECHA, we want to improve the public consultation process also more generally than just for application for authorization. And so we'll be looking into this a bit more widely. And one of the things that we may consider is having a special session at the next Accredited Stakeholder Organizations Day to discuss this a bit further. With that, I thank you for your attention. And if you have any additional questions or need for support, then please email the application for authorization team here at ECHA. You can see the address there again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sanna. I hope you have now a better overview of how the process works and how to give helpful comments. Now I'll give the floor to our first guest speaker, Hugo Waeterschoot from Eurometaux, who will talk about his experience in dealing with public consultations.
Applicants very often see the public consultation a bit as an annoyance, because it's all about what other information have others about substituting your market. So the question is this an issue of search for the Holy Grail, or can we really find common grounds where such assessment is relevant for the applicants, third parties, as well as for ECHA's committees? And what I try to give you here is an experience-based recommendation for a successful public consultation, actually for all involved stakeholders. And I will dwell into three small issues: social values, economic technical feasibility issue, and describing your use. But first and utmost importance is we assume that as an industry, if you submit for an application, you really mean it and you believe in a sound case. Most importantly then is that you describe the use in a very relevant way for the public consultation. You can do it very broadly, of course, like a substance for use in the automotive batteries, or you can be much more precise. Let's say, for example, substances used in the anodes for an automotive battery, allowing cold starts and available for batteries for more than 1 million tonnes a year. And that's actually what you want, because that's what your market is. So that's precisely what you should describe. It will help the other parties to respond focused. The second recommendation, which can really make your public consultation far more helpful, is be open on the economic and technical feasibility. Be transparent on them, without, of course, giving all the details, which could lead to business impact aspects. Be also clear on hazards and the risks of the alternatives. And I have here a little example. It's the use, for example, of a catalyst in a steam reforming plant, where such an assessment of alternatives and substitutes has been made, and actually they found several. They found several precious metals. And as the name says it, precious metals are costly. So price was certainly one of the parameters to assess. But also the effectiveness enhanced. And you could really see that the higher the price went, very often the higher the performance of the substance was. So that was probably in balance. So they thought, well, here we have a technical feasible alternative. But if you then looked, for example, to a parameter which you should completely not thought about, the availability of these material at worldwide scale, you would immediately see that you cannot even deliver a percentage about what you would need annually. So it was, and it became an economic feasibility issue. And that's my point. Be precise, but targeted, and say immediately what it is all about. Here your substances are relevant, but there's never going to be enough available on the globe. Societal values. They are not included actually in a normal public consultation, but it remains relevant to mention them. Provide this information on sustainability aspects, energy savings, criticality of a raw material, social welfare aspects, all have their role. And list them so that the other parties know why these substances have additional roles in society. That's an important role for the applicant to determine them all. The second one is, of course, third parties. Third parties that hold information can be NGOs, but very often other industries or research centers. And the message there is, if you deliver information and you want to be successful, please focus on the broad information of uses that is specified by the applicant. Really try to target your alternatives into that perspective. And not only provide the technicality of it, also give SEA information, hazard and risks eventually related to those alternatives. That, thirdly, will help the ECHA committees. The ECHA committees who have to assess all these materials, and they will organize at the start usually a trialogue where they invite those third parties that provided comments during the public consultation. And actually, when this is focused information, it can be easily assessed compared with the dossier of the applicant. And if those three parties work together, I'm sure that the Holy Grail can shed some light sometimes in that dark tunnel. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugo, for your insightful views. Next, Frida Hök joins us from the Chemical Secretariat and presents the NGO perspective on the public consultation process.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this webinar. I will start with very shortly talk about Chemsec, and then I will focus on producer and uses of safer alternatives. What in our view, in Chemsec's view, you need to focus on in order to contribute efficiently to the public consultation for application for authorization. But first, short about Chemsec. We are an environmental NGO working for progressive chemicals legislation. We do this by working with and trying to bridge the gap between policymakers, scientists, and businesses, including investors. We have a group of progressive companies, and we are also developing tools for businesses to support them on their way to progressive chemicals management. And our toolbox contains of the well-known SIN list, which uses the REACH candidate list criteria to cover over 800 substances. We have Similarity, a tool to use to avoid regrettable substitution. We have SIN Producer, which helps investors to calculate risk due to chemical production of substance of very high concern. And we have our newest tool, the Textile Guide, which aims at guiding the textile sector to a more progressive chemicals management. But this is about Chemsec, and now to today's focus, how to best contribute to public consultation. And as I said before, I will mainly address producers and use of safer alternatives, what you need to focus on in order to contribute efficiently to the public consultation, and provide you with reasonings for doing this at all. And first of all, as producer of alternatives to a substance of very high concern, you need to understand that the public consultation is a market opportunity for you. It's a possibility for you to profile your company and to reach new customers. And to make use of this market opportunity, you need to reply to the public consultation, and you need to reply with accurate information. And this means that you in the public consultation should state the implications for you as an alternative producers if authorization isn't granted. And that means that your demand might grow for your substance. You might get a larger market share. You might be able to scale up production. You might be able to expand or recruit, and maybe prices on your alternative will go down when production increases. On the other side, you should also state the implication for you as an alternative producer if authorization is granted for the actual substance. This means that maybe expected sales won't materialize, maybe your market share will not grow, maybe investments in the development of the alternative will not pay off, maybe you will feel that your product will be stamped as a not good enough alternative, and you might be disfavored. Also here you need to verify these claims if you use them and be as concrete as possible. So when writing your reply, to make it useful, please remember to be concrete. Specify the economic consequences as detailed as possible, both the positive and the negative ones. Be honest. If your alternative is suitable for parts of the uses applied for, well, state this very clearly. Be proactive. If your product can be developed to cover other uses in the future, state when you expect this to happen. And be correct. If any information stated in the application alternatives assessment about your product is wrong, please correct this. And be present. Reply to the public consultation, take part in the trialogue, and answer questions from ECHA. And see the public consultation as a market opportunity. So good luck with your submissions, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Frida. Now, Jan Ahlskog from Finsbury International Policy and Regulatory Advisors will share his experience on commenting during a public consultation.
Thank you, Matti. Dear participants, I'm obviously very grateful for the opportunity to speak and present briefly on an issue which is very important in the whole process of authorization and overall what relates to the REACH regulation. The part that we are covering, substitution, is obviously one of the key objectives. It is very important when we look at it from the perspective of applicants, obviously for the two committees who have to assess, and at the end of the day, mainly for those who are producing alternatives, whether these are substances, technologies, or combination of both. I'm trying to explain and describe what is important and good to have and what you absolutely must have in the process when you participate in the public consultation. It's, in view of the time, quite a challenge because normally you have 8 weeks during which you have to try and explain, describe, justify why your substance or technology would be a viable and suitable alternative for what the applicants are trying to seek an authorization for. In the good to have, you have issues like life cycle assessments, you have socioeconomic analysis, client endorsements, compliance certificates, and market data. All of those are not easy to carry out because a life cycle assessment may take time, maybe beyond the resources of many, let's say, small startups who may have an interesting technology. And yet again, also when we talk about socio-economic analysis, is not something which companies usually do or carry out without there being a specific need. At the same time, your credibility in view of your substance and technology very much relates to also how well you can provide evidence, therefore client endorsements, enabling you to show that this is already an existing one, it's being used, clients believe it's very good, and so forth. Compliance certificates equally, which also demonstrate that you have carried out tests or there have been tests carried out on your specific substances or technologies. And then market data, which purports to show what kind of potential you would have to satisfy market needs. So that all is good to have, I would say. Then we have what we would consider must have. So when you go and participate in the public consultation, you need and you must have a clear description of the substance or technology. This is vital. You have to be able to describe in a manner which is understandable to the committee members as well as to the applicants where you actually and what kind of role and where you and how you could be used. You need to have substance safety data sheets. Now this may be easy or complex depending on the situation. Sometimes you have simply one substance which you produce, so it's only about that substance. Sometimes you have an alternative which consists of a technology, and there you use a number of substances which replace a current one that requires authorization. Now you need to screen carefully what the data requirements are, what those substances are, they registered under REACH, are they tested and so forth, so that there is full clarity over their potential and existing known harms, the quantities used and so forth. You also need to have a clear and good description of the possible uses, because often you may have a very clear specific use, but it could also well be that your case is relevant for broader uses, and that could be interesting for the public consultation. So you need to understand and be able to clearly describe what is the specific use so that it can be also let's say it can be captured by the committees assessing you as well as also the applicants when they need to respond to your submission. You also need to have a clear understanding of the potential risks to health and environment so that there isn't a case that a substance which is subject to authorization will be substituted by something else which at the end of the day will and may have unknown, unintended consequences. So all of those need to be discovered well in advance and should be well described. Additional tips which would help, knowing that the process is challenging, it's something which is not business as usual for most organizations, is that you need to start early. Don't wait until the consultation period. Try and prepare, get information as early on, prepare your own organization. Try and identify early on what your core team looks like, because those need to work closely for a period when a lot of information may have to be processed, a lot of information may have to be presented, and that often comes as a bit of a surprise. So an early start, good recognition and identification of a team and organized well will make the task easier. Also, it is very important to gather all evidence on hazard and risks well in advance, identify possible gaps and knowledge areas which you need to cover and risks that need to be assessed, and do that so that you can have it all ready for the period when the consultation is open. You also need to understand and assess the potential uses, and that of course is something that you have to do and prepare ideally in advance. And then be aware of the fact that the committee is assessing your substance, or technology, may not and will not be expert. So visual aids are very important and very good. Try to describe your case in a manner which is easily understood. Those people which are assessing them are not experts of your technologies or your substances. Therefore, highly technical evidence may be lost, and therefore try and keep it simple, keep it understandable, and any visual aids which help to demonstrate how it actually works, how it's used, is always extremely good. Thank you, and I hope this was very helpful in the process of substitution.
Thank you, Jan. Our last speaker of the day, Julius Waller from EPPA, will explain the perspective on an applicant for authorization and how the public consultation comments affect their work.
Thank you, Matti. So I'll give you a perspective on public consultations from the perspective of the applicant, because for my sins I was involved in the one with the most responses on an authorization case. What can I tell you? Remember, any application for authorization is made from the perspective of the applicant, and therefore by definition rather specific to the company or person, but generally company that is applying. When you are thinking about responding, keep in mind that there is the technical function that is defined in the analysis of alternatives, and please do read that. The constraints which the applicant are under can also be quite specific, and it's something that you should examine when you are thinking about making a response and saying, I have an alternative, or perhaps I agree totally with what the applicant is saying. Even companies that are in rather similar businesses or competitors of one another do not necessarily operate under the same constraints. The last thing to remember is, please remember that the consultation is about alternatives. Of all the responses that I saw, 30% were about something else altogether than alternatives. 30% were really, quite frankly, platitudes of the type, I can do without it, I agree with the applicant, I don't like the substance. This doesn't add anything to the debate and is a waste of everybody's time, including ECHA's and your own. And 30% of the responses overlooked really quite critical technical functions of the substance that was at stake. And so it's very hard to respond to them except to say, well, this is very interesting what you're saying, but it doesn't apply to me, which also is not very satisfactory, I think, for anybody. And finally, please avoid substituting bad for bad. I think in the trichloroethylene case, some of the substances that were most debated as alternatives are now next on the list to be put on the authorization, and this doesn't make any sense. So read the analysis of alternatives. I know it can be a pain, they can be long, but if you don't do that, you cannot make a constructive submission. I do believe, however, there are two different scenarios. And the one on the right you see there, or on the left for you maybe, is for the downstream user application, which I think is different from a producer style application. Downstream user applications tend to be very specific. The downstream user is trying to do something, usually a process, with a particular chemical. And if you're going to suggest something, you can suggest technology solutions, which may be completely out of the scope of substitution of a substance for another, but change the process altogether. Offer realistic solutions, however. We've seen some people offering very hypothetical possibilities, or possibilities that could never be scaled up to the level and speed of production that the applicant required. And finally, take into account that they have a client base, maybe it's pharmaceuticals, they have very high standards that they require of their suppliers, that their manufacturing site is in a particular location, which creates a constraint, the product, etc. All of that may not be the same for them as it is for you. In producer applications, I think it's different. There, the producer tends to try and cover quite a lot of people downstream, anyone from 5 to 100 or 200 companies. And there you can respond if you have something concrete, because by definition, these uses will be quite broad. And if they are broad, it means that there may be areas where substitution is possible, even if it's not possible in others. I think this is something that's important to know. You should show that the alternative works within the logic of the methodology that the applicant put out. He didn't develop that methodology or that technical function for nothing. And please do not simplify. Do not extrapolate your single success in one very specific case to a generally applicable alternative for a producer, because it just doesn't work like that. Certainly, there might be an individual instance where it will work, but it does not necessarily work in all cases. So, finally, some experience. The quality of the responses, as I've already alluded to, has unfortunately been rather poor. And I think this is a shame, because as an applicant, if you get good opposition, your dossier becomes stronger, and the recommendations from SEAC regarding the validity of the analysis of alternatives also become stronger. If you have an alternative, please participate in the trialogue. In the ones that I was involved in, certainly the system was adversarial, and I debated, and my client debated against another large company who had a different point of view, and we kind of beat each other up, if you like. But for SEAC, this was extremely helpful, because everybody expressed and they could sense where the differences were. The world is not black and white. It's not as easy to say, oh, you're a bad guy, you're using something you shouldn't, and whereas you don't need to. It's a little bit more subtle than that. And by having this debate publicly in the trialogue, the SEAC experts are able to determine how strong the case of the applicant is, or how strong the case of the commenter is. It will create consensus over the outcome, and also, I think, acceptance, both for the applicant and for the commenters and for other people around, that the debate was clear and that the outcome is also justifiable. If you have an alternative technology or an alternative substance, see it as a marketing opportunity. You are selling your product into a new market if the old substance is displaced by the regulatory process. And this is, somebody's loss is your gain. And that's part of the socioeconomic assessment as well. If you don't speak up, please do not start crying afterwards that your voice was not heard, that ECHA overlooked something absolutely obvious. The public consultation is there to make yourself known. You don't have to declare everything. SEAC will ask you questions. From the process, questions will arise. But don't stay silent or make some vague comment and then say, well, this whole thing doesn't work. Because it does work.
Okay, thank you, Julius, for your presentation. Thanks all for your presentation, Sanna, as well. We have now all gathered here so that we can discuss several items that have been coming from your presentations, as well as questions that have been prepared for this. And if I may, I just start with the first question. In some consultations, we don't receive any comments at all, and in others, the comments received are sometimes of fairly low quality. What are possible constraints that third parties face in submitting comments that are helpful for the opinion development?
Well, if I might intervene the first, I think, of course, the applicant has, if he's smart, taken 2 years to prepare his application, and so he has a considerable advantage in having researched the matter and put all together the analysis of alternatives. And in the end, the public consultation lasts the period that it lasts, which is a number of weeks. And any commenter has to both understand the use and at the same time also understand the technical function for the applicant of the substance or process that we're talking about. So that makes it difficult for them to respond. On the other hand, what you often find is that people didn't even bother to read enough of the analysis of alternatives to make a meaningful comment, which in turn would allow SEAC to question them further if you're making a sensible comment.
Mm-hmm. But Julius, I'm actually not so concerned by the fact that so far there were not that many comments. Because I believe that on substances that were under regulatory scrutiny for 20, 30 or more years, actually the pressure has led to either reduced use or substitution. If you look what's now on the table, it's very much CMRs. It's regulated by several restrictions, by workplace legislation. And actually for that endpoint, it's logic that people were searching for a long time for alternatives were relevant. And if they were relevant, economically and feasible, they should have imposed them. Alternatively, if new endpoints gonna come up, endocrine disruptor, PBT, I honestly expect that there is far more of a potential, the public consultation being a very useful platform.
That's true.
Going back to the point of low number of submissions, I think it's certainly due to lack of information within the group who could provide alternatives. They simply don't know, they don't understand the process, they don't know, even if they're aware of the process, they don't actually know what their submission will all be about, what's in it for them, how does it impact the outcome of the applicant's case, and so forth. So one problem in view of low number is simply lack of information, and that links to or has also an impact on the fact that you have two different or several possibilities. Either you are a provider of a substitute which is focusing on a substance, or you work on another chemical substance which has other hazard profiles, and or then you work with a alternative technology which replaces a function, and therefore you may be in a completely different business, and REACH is not something you deal with on a normal basis.
Just go ahead. Okay.
I also think that it's a main issue that the alternatives producer don't know about this public consultation, don't understand the incentives for them, the market opportunities. And I also think it's difficult for them to actually do high quality replies, since the uses must be very clearly defined to be able to leave very clearly responses. So that is something for both the applicant and both for ECHA and ECHA committees to make sure that the uses are clearly defined. And also I think that it's necessary for ECHA committees to have a continuous discussion with the ones providing comments, because they might not do the high quality for the first time, they might not be totally on the spot, but if you have a communication, you will be more able to get the right information. So I think that's also an improvement that can be made.
This is true, and there, just in relation to that, it's also worth noting that the committees can go back to the third parties, and they do so, to ask follow-up questions to find out more specific information. And then, as many are aware, there's the trialogue, which is an opportunity to actually invite them in and discuss the potential alternatives with the applicant, either face-to-face or through WebEx, where they can have an actual dialogue between themselves.
Yeah, but Sanna, actually substitution is not only regulatory driven, it's also market driven, actually. And I'm not sure that people who have really valuable alternatives sometimes at hand will come forward with it during the public consultation, because either there are no patents yet, or they are still under protection or under research, and they not necessarily want to give an advantage. So personally, I would not see the public consultation numbers being critical. What is far more important is what you two said, is if there is something that has been really missed by the applicant and that is relevant and technically and economically feasible, that should be tabled, and therefore the description should be precise, and therefore the answer should be precise.
There's one thing we should say, which is that it's not the commenter that really needs to prove the case. In the end, SEAC will decide, is it a valid argumentation, yes or no? So if you make a reasonable submission that says more than some platitude, and you get questions from ECHA, or you participate in the trialogue, I think the trialogue and the ones which were controversial, which I participated in, were very useful, because there was just debate, and like in any scientific debate, there's an A and a minus A side, and okay, I felt that at the time the outcomes you can feel more or less the way it goes, but it is SEAC who will take the decision independently. So we mustn't raise the bar too high either. Comment on something that is concrete and helpful, and then participate in the process, and ECHA will assist you, won't you, Matti?
Of course we will. There's actually two issues that are coming up. One is that the alternatives producers might not be even aware, and that's of course partly related to the fact that not everybody is reading REACH as their favorite bedtime reading, and how can we maybe improve there is one question, partly to ECHA and of course to others as well as ideas. Then the other one is, I think, what you are saying, that there might be actually alternatives around there, but the ones who have them are not necessarily willing to provide this information. Do you see this as a problem per se, or is this actually almost like a marketplace for information, which then maybe goes bilateral between maybe the alternatives producers and the applicant in the longer term to actually come up with alternatives, rather than just a one-spot event? So there are two questions I'm asking.
I think the ideal situation would be if it was both. that it really contributed to the public consultation for the specific substances that you were discussing at that time, but it also led to more, connection with new companies, and it's like a marketplace, as you say. I think actually we will know how important this will be and how it will develop when we have more cases that has gone through the Commission as well. When we know that, will the comments from alternative producer actually be taken into account, or not enough? I mean, I think that will also make the incentive lower or higher for the alternative producers to provide information if they see that they have an impact, or if they see that the impact is very, very low or limited. So I think that's important.
Okay.
And I just, following on that, I think from the perspective of an alternative provider, it's obviously very important that they are involved at an early stage, that they know early on what they need to do, what data they should focus on, how to compile their dossiers. But also that's something where they can help the applicants, and they will definitely be able to help the committee. So whereas the public consultation, it's a slot of 8 weeks, it's very short. You can improve probably a lot of things to get more participants, but for the outcome to be good, you need to be throughout the process involved. So submit more information early on, let the applicants know, because then also as well, by the time you reach the consultation, are you really a substitute? Because often it may well happen that you think they're a substitute for A, but actually you're a substitute for B, and therefore your submission doesn't quite go in the right direction, because the uses, as we've seen and was already raised, the uses have not always been defined in such a way that it helps. They may be very broad or very narrow, and for an alternative, you don't always fit in that box. So you have to understand, you have to do a lot of work.
Regarding the timing, there is one thing actually that ECHA could do to give a bit more time to comment submitters, and that is that at the moment the public consultation starts only about 2 months after the applications have been submitted, and there are various process reasons for that. But already when ECHA gets the application, we could actually do some kind of notification and give a bit more information about what uses will come up for the public consultation, even if we don't tell the names of the companies, but at least name the uses, and in that way it would be at least about almost 2 months more.
But that's about timing, and for me it's still short term. There are two issues here. One, there is a whole communication issue, and the people that are listening to this webinar are presumably not the one that have the alternatives and that didn't declare them, okay? They're just not there. The question is, how can you reach them? That's one part. But on timing, I think honestly, if you want really to develop either a drop-in alternative or a structural alternative, which is very often not a chemical but a process change, that takes years. In an industrial scale, maybe even up to 10 years. And just by luck, this public consultation must fit in with these 2 months or 4 months, and that's not really going to make it. It's maybe. And if that's the case, and that's optimal, and the thing is patented, presumably the people will come out. That's in their benefit. But the whole other process isn't. And the question is, of course, is REACH and or other agendas on chemicals going to influence that? Personally, I think many industries go more to sustainable practices, and they should build it into their systems. But you're not going to see it too soon. And a public consultation is something you absolutely need, I agree, but it must be complemented with all the other work. And much of that happens on the market naturally, and you need to stimulate that too.
No, but what you want to weed out, Matti, are guys who don't substitute while there is a possibility to substitute. The problem is that, particularly for producer applications, you can come up and say, I have something that kind of does the same thing, and I believe it's good enough. But I don't believe it's good enough as the applicant, because I see certain constraints that you don't see. Perhaps my product has longer life, or is in a more aggressive environment, etc., etc. All things that are not immediately obvious. And those are the kind of things that you can get out in a debate. And whilst I appreciate what you're saying, Hugo, about patents and so forth, I'm a firm believer in transparency. I think all the dossiers I worked on, everything was always public except the sales figures of the company, because you need to have this public debate, otherwise you cannot get a meaningful answer.
Yeah, and I think the fact that you share information is, of course, it's vital. But also, when you say, would it help to give an early warning and announce or publish the uses, that would be tremendously useful. But of course, I mean, they have to start before that already, because even then there isn't that much time left to do a good job. Sometimes it can be easy. It may be that you have a very simple, straightforward substitution where your own case is not too complex. But if you are in an environment where it's part of a highly complex process, it takes a long time to prepare everything. So the question is really, how early can you be out with information that would help alternatives to do a good job, and just announcing the uses at the time when basically you're looking at the application is not providing much more, but that would already help. But then the applicants who decide on the uses, so can you go beyond that? Can you therefore announce something before that? Probably, but then it's in a slightly sort of guesstimate style.
Yeah, I mean, we know, of course, which substances have their latest application dates and sunset dates, and based on that, we can make a bit more information available on that, or put it more forward. But it's still, we won't be able to say who is applying for exactly what use until we actually have the applications. So there's a bit of constraints in that.
But then at least liberate the amount of space you can devote to the definition of your use, because right now you're space constrained, and this creates a problem sometimes in being clear enough, because you try and you have to be so succinct that you get too general. And if you multiply the number of users, you have to pay every time again. So if you had a little bit more space to define something, that would be really helpful.
But I think that what you said, Sanna, that to improve the communication around the substitution at a very early stage would also be very useful, so that, I mean, the companies with alternative products, technologies, chemicals know that this is a process. We have the candidate list, we have Annex 14, and we have a process for authorization. To say that, I mean, if you produce alternatives for any of these, follow this process. I mean, to communicate that more clearly, that regarding substitution, I think that would be very useful.
But these aspects focused a lot on communication and communication timing. But in the previous point, we were discussing a little bit about quality, and that fits here too, I think. I think people that have potentials for alternatives, I'm careful here because it needs to be checked with use, of course. They need to understand that their dossier also needs to be of good quality. We saw sometimes a 2-pager coming in to substitute something which was a very profound document. So they really need also to understand, like you indicated, they need to go and look to the technical feasibility aspect, read that, the economic one, and see what the alternative can be. So a public consultation is really good, and it's something that you plan for long in advance if it's going to come up, more than the 4 months if you wish, if you really feel it is relevant, it has societal relevance. And very often that may rather come from the industry themselves, from other companies, than from other societal partners, I believe.
What I'm hearing in a sense is that the consultation is short, which is by definition has to be fairly short, because given that the whole opinion making period is fairly short. And then we can maybe make it longer by some pre-announcement, but that would not really solve the problem, because the problem on research and development is much more longer term. So is there maybe in your view some sort of an expectation which is too high for the public consultation itself to solve many of the issues which lead to substitution, like an overloading of the public consultation boat? In other words, should there be some sort of a process that should be built in better, that during the application preparation stage already the alternatives discussion would be improved, so that the consultation is rather a checkup at that stage?
Anything you can do in that direction is helpful, because for the applicant nothing is more frustrating than going through the whole process with ECHA, getting a positive recommendation, the dossier that goes to the commission, which is supposed to look at the legal technical things, and then somebody stands up and says, yeah, but I don't think my alternative was correctly assessed by ECHA. And if they make enough noise, then they can be heard. And this is not what the process of REACH was intended to be. So that has to happen in the process with the independent scientific committees assessing things, not in an arena where you don't know who's talking to who and who's getting what information or what the value of that information is.
Yeah, I think. Go ahead.
In a normal quality business system, in a quality system, I think assessing alternatives for lower hazards or lower risks should be part of the system, okay? And that's what we really want to aim for. Not only the regulators, I'm sure that also most of the companies would like to do, building that into their system. And several have done, not all, several have done that for endpoints which were logic, like the CMRs. And that's also why they don't react. But I think what we should try to get is a system where companies themselves realize that from the start of the development, for given endpoints which are now PBT or equivalent concern, they should do the same. They should build it into their system, and the drive for alternative assessments should be built into their research. And betting on the public consultation, it's a small part of the chain here. It has its value, but it's that spirit that is much more important, I believe, to get a real change in how chemicals are used.
I think that ECHA committees, I mean, even if you improve time and communication, I think these are good things to do. But I think you also need to understand that not all information will be provided of different reasons, many different reasons, in the consultation. So you need to sort of take that into account, and that the applicant will spend several years on his application, but from the other parties, so the other side, you will not have the same information, and you need to find a way to deal with that. And also that committees need to be more active, I think, to find the right relevant information to be able to make good opinions, solid opinions, to bring in both sides. So that's not that the committees, as you said before, can do. I think they really should do. It's an obligation for them to make sure that they bring in the relevant information.
But the idea in REACH is to use the public consultation as a check whether the information is there, because the committees cannot search for information that goes beyond. They use make the opinions based on the information that they get. They are not doing the applicant's work.
But the trialogue is there for that.
The trialogue is exactly for that checking. Then, if that relevant information coming forward. What do you think? This in particular to Jan, for instance, to you this question. Because when you're trying to reach alternative technology producers, they are not following necessarily REACH at all. They're just in completely different forum. How would you think that we could improve the reach out for those groups of people? Because they're not following REACH, and therefore we have difficulties in that. But if you have any ideas about that.
It's a very tough challenge, but obviously, I mean, one has to think outside the box, out of the box, and look at where do these come from, and the answer is, well, they probably come from all over the place and from many areas where you don't even look for them, hence you wouldn't normally go and send information. So it probably would be more efficient to try and reach broader organizations, whether they're chambers of commerce, which are more horizontal, and make them understand it's an educational thing. You have many sectoral organizations that know about REACH but actually do not yet educate their own members either about what actually it all means in the borders, and particularly for technology providers. I think if in the EU context there is a way of sharing that information, it can go through many different channels, as I said, but trade associations, chambers of commerce, and the likes, who have their own ways of. But it's really about how do you address that message so that it's attractive for them. How do they understand, who normally wouldn't look into this area, that there is a business opportunity for you there, that this is not only a regulatory something, but it's actually real business for you. And the more the markets, the more the people know about your upcoming or existing already alternative, the better it will be for all the actors.
But would that not be much more automated, if I may, if application should be done more at a downstream user level? I mean, we can expect that upstream, an importer, for example, he wants to sell his material, whatever it is. Seems to me a logic business opportunity. But the downstream user, he wants, for example, to make an article of the best quality and in the best economic terms. Now, he may not be married with a given chemical, and he may not be married with a given technology. So I'm a believer that more downstream user applications could rather catalyze more interest
Absolutely.
of technology firms and others, but also from the downstream users to watch for those, because that's what we really aim at. Because it's much more direct to the point that is up for potential substitution.
I think what you're absolutely right is that there should be more downstream user applications and people should not be scared to apply on their own. I don't quite agree with what you say in terms of the supplier of the substance, because if he's a company with a long-term perspective, he's providing the alternatives if they exist already. And in all the cases I've seen, the substance producer was extremely well aware of what was potentially as substitutes, but he also knew why it didn't work in certain cases. So, but definitely downstream users should not be shy. You can get through the process here at ECHA and gain the time that you need sometimes to make a difficult substitution.
There's also, at least we've seen, the formulators who are downstream users in a sense, but we're very different sort of halfway. They actually play an important role in this as well, because they are again not married to chemicals but married to the functions, and the client, they know the client's needs sometimes much better than anybody else. So they also can do that. I think we are starting to get to the close of the panel. Would you have any particular wishes to the audience who's listening to us when they're providing their comments, we hope, during the public consultation, and what they might be, and also any wishes to each other or to ECHA in how to improve things? Maybe we start with the ladies first, so Frida.
Thank you. Well, I hope the companies that are listening to us will provide information in the public consultation, and I hope we have sort of shown that it's important and that these companies can see it as a market opportunity. I think ECHA has a few things that could be done to improve the process to help the companies, both the applicants but also the ones who replies to the public consultation. Communication, but also a way to realize that all information will not be included here, and you need to work with that.
Okay. Yeah.
I think, it's still early days because the process is at the end of, if we look at it now, it's new, it's a learning curve, so a lot of things have already improved. There are certainly very many good positive elements. The public consultation, the new habit of organizing a trialogue is very useful. Your registry or database, which is now also open for alternative providers, helpful. It needs to be, of course, promoted, much more disseminated, and hopefully all different actors or stakeholders will find such databases, because it's through those that you will then be able to share the information, to get out there early on. That would also help applicants, committee members, whoever, not least the alternatives as well. But I think it's good work, but it just has to continue, and the challenge is really how to communicate to those who don't naturally understand that there is a need and there's an opportunity out there.
One way to see communication is also to use consultants who are very much aware of all different kinds of needs, and they play a sort of information role. So you have worked quite a lot. So any particular wishes in that direction for the audience?
Well, I want to say something more. REACH is going to be part and parcel of the future of the European chemical industry and has a global influence. Be a part of it, participate. I think even if you're just responding to a public consultation, you're not only doing something which I would say is a civic duty, but at the same time you're also learning for yourself, because you may be in the situation that you need to deal with some of the REACH aspects, not necessarily authorization, it could be restriction, evaluation, or what have you, and you get on the learning curves and you gain experience, because REACH is really at the core of how chemicals are going to be used in Europe and probably the world. So you don't lose anything, just pitch in.
Any last thoughts, Hugo?
Yeah, actually I have a message for the applicants. Honestly, applicants are the one that really should do a good assessment of alternative and really build that into their system. I think that is really critical. For my feeling, the best public consultation is that everybody that scrutinized the application said, this guy did a good job. He looked to it, he has looked to all the things, he manages it, and he had good reasons to submit. So the best public consultation is where people really assessed it but came to the conclusion there was no need for it.
At the end of the day, yeah. And then we learned a couple of lessons. Sanna, any last thoughts how we can actually improve?
Well, yes, I think this is a continuous effort from ECHA's side, and we've done a lot to improve the consultation already and to increase transparency. But it's an ongoing process, and there's still lots to do. And we got some useful food for thought here today. With just for the audience here listening, I would really recommend that you sign up for the ECHA weekly news, where you get the information about all of these public consultations. And I hope that those that know about alternatives really do submit comments in the public consultation and also spread the message to everyone else.
We are now coming to the end of the webinar. I hope that it has been helpful for you to better understand the process of public consultations for the authorization applications and how you can make your contributions count. Thank you to our panelists and the presenters, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. We will send you a link of the recording and the presentations shortly after the webinar. When the webinar closes, you will be automatically redirected to a short feedback questionnaire. It should take a couple of minutes to fill in, so please take the time to share your comments and your suggestions with us so that we can further develop and improve our webinars to meet your needs. If you have not already done so, remember to follow us on your social media channels and subscribe to our news from the ECHA homepage, or stay up to date about any ongoing public consultation. Thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you again in our upcoming webinars.